Previously on This Is Us.
That Jesus is the safest place for real people with real problems, with real lives, and with real questions.
We had raised these great kids, had a business that was successful, and then everything crashed like a house of cards.
But what I saw was that when I changed, everything else changed too. So I became more gracious and forgiving, and Jeff and I, our marriage got stronger, and I became a better mom. And so in the end, I think the best thing for her was the change in me.
And he just let me ask questions, real questions, hard questions.
Keen, who has Jesus ever really changed? And if you know his background, he's got a
Seminary.
Yeah, I'm not equipped to argue the Bible with my husband. But what I said to him was, I just looked at him and I said, you know what, Jesus changed me.
That even though we're not ideal, even though we're a mess sometimes, even though I make some mistakes that hurt others, even though others have hurt me, even though the world is a mess, that we have discovered that Jesus runs toward us, no matter who the us is.
Well, I am really excited to introduce the person who's going to be telling his story today, because he has an incredible story. John Antonucci, and the story that he's going to tell is, as we've been thinking about it, it's not an easy story to listen to. It's not a story that we want to hear, because it brings up some hard questions. It brings up some tough questions that I think everybody will ask at some point if you haven't already asked it. And that's why it's even though we don't want to hear it, it's an important question to hear. It's an important story to listen to. Really, really important. Before we get to that, though, let me remind you of what This Is Us is all about. This Is Us is a series where we've asked several people in our group, in our church, to come and share their stories as authentically and as honestly as they can. Because the reality is, our lives, as much as oftentimes you walk into a church and it's like, church is for it's ideal, perfect people, and everybody looks fine. The reality is we don't believe that. We're so far from perfect. We're so far from ideal. We live very real, very messy, sometimes very awkward lives in the same broken world as everybody else lives, and we face the same pain, the same things, and sometimes make questionable decisions and sometimes struggle with things. But the reality is, this is us. And what we've discovered is that Jesus, the real Jesus, not this religious figure that, sometimes puts people off and a bad church experience that you may have had, the real Jesus runs toward us, no matter who the us is. And the reality is, no matter what you believe about Jesus, this man showed up in the first century, and anyone and everyone that he interacted with was impacted by him in some way. So much so that the people back then actually literally divided the calendar in two. That every time, even if you don't believe he's the Son of God, the impact that he had on the world has been tremendous. That every time you write a date, you're actually pointing to the man Jesus Christ. It's crazy if you think about that. But his impact on the world was amazing. There was this one family that he had this interaction with, and it changed their perspective and it changed their lives. It was a family of 3 siblings, Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And the reason I remind you of this story or tell you about the story is because John's story mirrors this story in an interesting way. And these 3 people actually became very close friends of Jesus. Not just disciples, teacher, disciple, but really close friends with Jesus. And then one time while Jesus was traveling and teaching around the country, Lazarus got really sick, like dying sick. And his sisters freaked out, and they were like, where is Jesus? We've watched him impact people. We've watched him heal people. We need to call Jesus now and let him come. And so they called him. And then Jesus did one of the most frustrating things ever. He didn't come. He got the message, but he didn't come. And in that moment, they're calling him. Lazarus died. And that brought up so many questions. Jesus never came through for them. And it's with that I want to introduce to you, as part of This Is Us, John Antonucci.
All right. Well, hello, guys. I'm glad to be here with you this morning, sharing my story with you. Some of you know me, some of you may not. I've been here at Citrus Point for about 10 months and working with the students in transit, and I'm extremely honored that I was asked and I get to share my story with you this morning. Before I jump into my story, I want to introduce you to some people who are a very big part of my story, and that is my family. So we actually have a picture of my family currently. This was actually back in February. This is at my brother's wedding, so got a new sister-in-law there, but this is me, obviously, my dad, brother and sister-in-law Michelle, my mom, my sister Jess, and my brother-in-law John. And yes, his name is John, and my dad's name is John, and my name is John. 3 Johns in our family. It can get a little bit confusing at times. And then my sister has a couple little ones. So Caleb is pictured here. He's the oldest, 2.5 years old. He's the craziest and the cutest kid you'll ever meet. She also has another son named Asher. I actually asked my sister to send me a picture of Asher to Photoshop him into this picture. And she said no. She said, actually, he won't care. He's not going to remember. And I was like, is that how you parent? He's not going to remember. Anyway, we'll talk about that more after church. So back in 2003, I want to show you a picture of my story back in 2003, which is when this part of my story happened. So I was 13 years old, obviously mom, dad, brother, and sister. And in this picture, I'm holding my ear for some reason that I'm not sure of. And as I was looking through pictures, like in this season of my life, every picture, I was wearing like a men's extra large t-shirt, and I was about 90 pounds soaking wet. And I still don't wear a men's extra large t-shirt. So as someone who works with middle schoolers, I know I struggled with an identity crisis that many middle schoolers do sometimes in their life. But anyway, that's my family back in 2003 when this part of my story begins. So 2003, we were living in New Jersey, and it was a very traumatic, very different summer for us because in July of 2003, my dad actually got the opportunity to pastor a church down in Florida, in Fort Myers, Florida. He had always worked in business. He was a very successful businessman, but he always had the sense that he wanted to work as a pastor, work in a church full time. And the opportunity arose in Fort Myers, Florida, and my dad's still there. He's still pastoring the same church in Fort Myers there. And so the opportunity came up, and we moved, and we left all of our family and all of our friends, and it was a very traumatic time for our family. But the reason why I bring that up is because it was also the summer when for whatever reason I left some friends and some negative influences back in New Jersey. And when I moved down to Florida, I made a personal decision to follow Jesus with my life. And I committed my life to Jesus, and I remember a conversation I had shortly after that with my dad, who was also like the pastor of my church, right? And telling him about this decision. And I remember my dad telling me, in 6 months, Jesus is going to radically change your life, that 6 months from now, you won't even recognize yourself. So that was in July or August of 2003. So fast forward 6 months, and it's January 2004. Specific date is January 14th, 2004. I'm sitting in a U.S. history classroom in my new school in 8th grade. And I remember the teacher, a man in his 50s, got a call from the main office, and he turned and looked at me and said, John, your mom's downstairs picking you up early from school. And I had no clue why, but every 8th grader would love to be picked up early from school by his mom. So I ran down to the office, and I said, okay, Mom, what's up? And she said, your doctor recommended that we go and get an MRI done, or you go and get an MRI, of your brain. So just a little context. Up until this point in my life, for about 3 years now, I'd been experiencing pretty bad headaches, sort of like an ongoing headache. I mean, I would take an Excedrin and it would go away, so we never thought anything much of it. But at this time, around January, my symptoms started increasing, and I started getting other symptoms like weariness, and I would just get really tired. I remember one time walking through Walmart with my mom and saying, I have to take a break and sit down. I'm so tired right now. And just dizziness and lightheadedness. And we were trying to figure out what was wrong. We went to 10 or 12 different doctors. And then finally, somebody said, I think you should go and get an MRI, just to rule out anything major. So it happened that a slot opened up on this day, and we drove over to the imaging center. And if you've had an MRI, you know what I was in store for, right? So an MRI is about an hour-long test where you're inserted into a tube, and like magnetically images are taken of your brain, and it's very loud as well. I don't know if you've ever had an MRI, but it's very loud. I don't know why. There's a lot of like banging going on. So I remember like the lab doctor said, you know, if you want to grab a CD, we can play it here in the room, and you know, over the loudspeakers, it'll drain out like the noise in the MRI. So I said, okay. Ran to my mom's car and grabbed a Mercy Me CD. Mercy Me is a Christian pop band, and played it over the loudspeakers, and the doctors were probably like, who is this kid playing I Can Only Imagine, like this real Christian song about heaven over the loudspeakers during an MRI? But like that was me. Like my dad was right. Like 6 months after I committed my life to Jesus, like I was a Jesus freak, like if you've ever heard of one, right? So we went through the MRI, and we finally get out of the test, and I remember going back to the waiting room, and my brother was there. My brother said, you know, are you scared? And I remember jokingly saying, like, I mean, no, it isn't like, it isn't like I have a brain tumor. I mean, I'm a normal kid. I played basketball, and I wrestled with my brother, and eventually the doctor came and grabbed us out of the waiting room and sat me and my mom down, and he said, rather bluntly, he said, John, you have a brain tumor. And in that moment, just this rush of millions of emotions, right? And my heartbeat went from probably like 90 to like 160, like in an instant. And I just felt like this overwhelming like fear and anxiety and worry, and what does this mean? But also like this overwhelming sense of peace. You know, like I said, like I follow Jesus now, and for some reason I felt like, you know, Jesus was gonna heal me. He was gonna bring me through this. And actually involuntarily in the moment when the doctor said you have a brain tumor, I actually like started praying out loud in the doctor's room, and the doctors were probably again like, what is up with this kid, right? And then he said to us, you know, in Fort Myers here, we don't exactly have the personnel to handle a case like yours, so they sent me up actually here to Tampa, and I got checked into Tampa General Hospital, and I got reevaluated by a neurosurgeon that night, and he said that what I had was actually not a cancerous brain tumor, thankfully, but it was an AVM, or an arteriovenous malformation. So basically what this is it's a cluster of abnormal like blood vessels in the brain that have sort of tangled together and clotted off on one end, so the blood continued to feed into this malformation that was growing and getting larger and larger. We actually have a scan and an x-ray. So this is like the front, this is my eyes over here would be, and my neck, and my AVM was actually sitting right on my brainstem, which controls all of your bodily movements. And the doctor told me that the AVM was the size of a potato. It was very large. It was an extremely rare, extremely difficult case for them. So much so that actually, like the next day, I went through some like minimally invasive treatment options, and none of them worked. And the doctors said, you know, what we're going to do is take some time. It was about 2 weeks, I think, and they said, you know, we're going to consult with doctors around the globe, and we're going to find out if anybody handled a case like this, and sort of get some advice on what to do. And it was during those 2 weeks that we, my family, we stood strong on our faith. Like I was raised to believe that Jesus still does miracles, and he can still heal. He can still miraculously heal you. So we were not just praying for a successful surgery or praying that the doctors would figure out what to do. We were praying that, but we were also praying for a miracle. Like we were praying that my AVM would disappear. I remember in the hospital, my mom stayed with me. She's actually here today, and she stayed with me for 2 months and slept on the couch next to me. So just imagine as a parent, I could think as a 13-year-old, but as a parent to go through that. And she stayed on the couch next to me, and one thing we did was we always filled our room with faith, never with doubt. And we played like 24/7. We played worship music to make sure we were believing. Someone gave us a healing confession pamphlet full of scriptures and prayers used for healing, and we would confess this every morning, multiple times a day. And during my hospital stay, I would be checked, every morning, daily, had a CAT scan brought back, and as we prayed this healing confession, I would go into that scan believing that like in some way God was going to heal me, and I was going to have a clear scan. And I would get out, and it would be the same, but I didn't waver. I still stood strong in my faith. I mentioned my dad is a pastor, so he has a lot of pastor friends. We had a lot of people come and visit me from other states. They flew in and laid their hand on my head and prayed for healing. We had one guy who called me in the hospital. Like, I was always exhausted, but I remember this flood of calls. And this one guy, he was a pastor and he was a doctor. And he called and he prayed with me, and he said, Johnny, as I pray, I see like this Pac-Man figure eating away your AVM, and it's going to be gone. And then I went into the scan the next morning, and it was still there. And then one time we got checked out of the hospital to attend a healing crusade here in Tampa. And I went expecting God to heal me, and we got prayed over, and I even fell down. I don't know if you've ever seen that on TV or ever been to a service like that. It can seem kind of strange, but I fell down after I was prayed for, and I got up believing that I was healed. And we went into the scan the next morning, and it was still there. It was the usual. And I was deflated, but I would never waver in my faith. I still believed that God was going to heal me. And then the doctors came and they said, we made a decision. And this is what they said. They said, after consulting with doctors across the globe, the overwhelming majority of them said not to do the surgery. Like, it's too risky. Like, the AVM is too large, and the location on the brainstem, like, there are too many bad things that can happen. And then after that, I remember the doctor saying, but if we don't do the surgery, your symptoms will remain, your AVM will probably rupture soon, cause bleeding on the brain, and probably death. So he said, against a lot of the counsel he had received, he was going to attempt to surgically remove the AVM. And the next thing that happened was a bunch of forms came in, and I saw my parents signing all these forms, sort of like if you were signing a form for your kid to do an obstacle course, but only a little more intense, like for a brain surgery. And thinking to myself, like, okay, this is getting real. And then on the morning of the surgery, I was waiting on my hospital bed, waiting for the transporters, which took like 3 hours. They were like 3 hours late, which didn't help things. And just thinking in my mind, like being a little confused, but thinking, okay, maybe God chose to heal me like through the surgery. Like, maybe he's going to use the doctors and bring about my healing that way. And the transporters came and rolled me back into the operating room, and I remember counting down from 100. And then the next thing I knew was I woke up in a room to smiling but teary-eyed parents. And I remember my dad coming over and saying, Johnny, we did it. And I was hooked to a ventilator, and my head felt like it was 1,000 pounds, but we made it. God did heal me. And we made it through. We were on the other side. We were victorious. And then a few days later, I began to breathe on my own again. A few days after that, I could lift my head on my own again. And then I remember my mom sometimes wheeling me up to the roof of Tampa General Hospital and looking out over Riverwalk and this beautiful city and just being so thankful, like, God has brought me through this. Like, sure, the doctors played a part, but ultimately God has healed me. And then came the night before the day I was going to be checked out of the hospital. So I was literally going to be checked out of the hospital the next day, and sometime during the night, I spiked a fever. And the fever hit 102, and then 103, and then 104, and then the nurses rushed in with ice packs, and then came nausea and chills, and they started doing tests, and hours turned into days, and I was not being checked out of the hospital, and I was thinking, what the heck is going on? And then my neurosurgeon got involved, and he did a few tests of his own, and he eventually came in and sat us down, and he looked at me with the look of, like, John, I wish I don't have to tell you what I'm about to tell you. And he said, I had contracted a rare form of staph infection in the hospital, in the operating room, while my head was open, this rare and extremely deadly form of staph infection. He said, actually, on top of that, the last girl who had this form of staph infection in the hospital had died from it. And then he said a phrase that I'll remember forever. He said, and I quote, he said, "We are going to have to reopen the wound, do another surgery, like start the whole process over again." So I went from feelings of excitement, I'm going home, nostalgia, it's over, we made it, to feeling like I had been punched in the gut and I was lying on a mat with a ref, like counting up to 10. And in that moment, I broke. See, up until this point, I had never cried in the hospital. Up until this point, I had never asked what if or why me or what if kinds of questions. But this, like a staph infection in my brain on the night before I'm about to go home from the hospital, like this was too much. And in that moment, I began to ask some questions in my mind that previously I had never even allowed myself to think of. Questions like, doesn't Jesus care? Like, I'm a Christian, right? My dad is a pastor. Like, he works for God full time. Like, I'm a 13-year-old kid. Doesn't Jesus care? Questions like what if this faith for healing thing doesn't work? Like, it hasn't seemed to work like I thought it was going to work so far. Questions like, what if I believe and I still die? I mean, years later, I would meet more faithful Christians, people who had stronger faith than me, who died early of cancer. Like a couple years after this, I prayed with a 14-year-old boy who had a brain tumor, and he died. It's like, what do you do with that? What about the girl? What about the girl who had the same form of staph infection, her parents walked out of Tampa General Hospital without a daughter? What do you do with that? I mean, what if the first surgery that I had wasn't really a miracle? What if it was like the work of some really brilliant doctors? And what if I was lucky last time? And what if my luck has run out this time? Essentially, I was asking the question, where is Jesus? Where is Jesus in all this? Because, 6 months ago, I became a Christian. I started following Jesus. And now I'm experiencing the worst time of my life. And it doesn't seem like Jesus is here in the way that I thought he was going to be here. Where is Jesus? See, this is a question that I think virtually all of us ask when we face a situation similar to this. If you're honest with yourself, if you're a Christian, you've probably asked this question at least one time in your life. If you're not a Christian, this question is probably one of, if not the main reasons why you're not a Christian. Because you look around and you see pain and suffering and your Christian friends who believed God and it didn't work out the way they thought it was going to work out. And then you go, where is Jesus in this world? And what's interesting is that even in the first century, like people asked this question to Jesus, to his face. It happened in the interaction that Justin mentioned previously, the interaction between this set of siblings, Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, right? So we're going to talk about this interaction because it really, as I look back, it reminds me a lot of my story. So what happened in this story, Lazarus, Jesus' good friend, rather, okay? He's not just some follower of Jesus. He was a good friend of Jesus. Lazarus gets sick, and Jesus heals sick people, right? So Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, send for Jesus and say, hey, Lazarus is sick. Come and heal Lazarus like you've healed so many other people before. And for some reason, it doesn't tell us why, Jesus delayed in coming. And as he delayed, Lazarus died. And we pick up in the story when his sisters are confused and thinking the same thing that I was. Where was Jesus in all this? Look at what it says when Jesus finally shows up 4 days after Lazarus is dead. It says, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary, her sister, stayed at home. She said, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Yeah, Martha was obviously one of those cut-to-the-chase kind of people. She didn't hold back any punches. She approaches Jesus before he gets into town and asks this question. And what's interesting is just minutes later, verses later, it says this. It says, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was, her sister, and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Like, did you notice that these two phrases are identical, exactly the same? Like, it makes me think, how many times did this set of sisters rehearse this to each other as they cared for their dying brother, Lazarus, and they looked out the window and said, where is Jesus? If only Jesus had been here, Lazarus wouldn't be sick. And then, if only Jesus was here, Lazarus wouldn't be dying. And then, if only Jesus had been here, Lazarus would not be dead. And then it goes on and says that when Jesus saw her weeping, Mary and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, the family and friends of this grieving family, it says that he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And then it goes on. It says, where have you laid him? He asked. Jesus asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And then, and it's the shortest verse in the entire Bible, 2 words, it says, Jesus wept. Jesus wept. And in the original language, what that actually means is that Jesus burst into tears. Like, he didn't just get teary-eyed and go, I'm sorry for your loss. No, he burst into tears. Like, it was an ugly cry that Jesus did that day as he looked and saw this scene of Mary crying and Martha crying and the onlookers and their dead brother, and he saw firsthand the reason why he came, the effects of death. Then it goes on and says that everybody saw Jesus crying. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. He really did. He really did care. But some of them asked the question, some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Could not he who has healed so many people, he cares about him, obviously, couldn't he have kept this man from dying? That was the same question that I was asking. Like, okay, I'm 13, I'm a Christian, my dad's a pastor, Jesus cares. Couldn't he have kept me from dying? Like, I was asking the question, Lord, Jesus, if you had been here, I wouldn't be sitting in the hospital with an AVM on my brainstem and then with a staph infection in my brain. Lord, if you had been here. And the thing is that all of us can probably finish this sentence. Lord, if you had been here, my marriage wouldn't have fallen apart. My kid wouldn't have turned their back on me. Lord, if you had been here, I wouldn't have this ongoing health problem, or I wouldn't have lost my job, or I wouldn't be where I'm at financially. Lord, if you had been there, I wouldn't have faced that abuse. I wouldn't have felt like that. Couldn't you have fixed things? Couldn't you have changed things? And the interesting and the awesome part of this story is that Jesus actually responds to their questions and allegations, and he responded to mine as well. Look at what he says. So as Martha approached Jesus and said with her question, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And then she went on and said, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. For some reason, when I hear this, I think of the scene. I think of Martha running out to Jesus and asking this question, Jesus, where have you been? And looking defeated with her shoulders bent over and staring at the ground, her eyes welling up with tears. And when Jesus goes here, when Jesus says your brother will rise again, for some reason I sense Martha's countenance changing just a little bit, like her shoulders going back and her eyes looking up and responding to Jesus. She said, Martha answered and said, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And in this moment, something happened. Like Jesus has shifted Martha's perspective a little bit, and for the first time in a long time, she's looked beyond her present situation and her present situation with her brother lying dead in a tomb a few feet away, and she's looked beyond that to something that Jews and Christians refer to as heaven, as what's next, as what's after this, all this. What's interesting is that it's only when Martha faced death, and it's only when I face death, and it's only when all of us face death, is that it's only then when we really ask the question and when we think about the whole what's next scenario, right? Like only when we go to funerals. I know for me, every time I go to a funeral, like I forget about every other problem that I have virtually, and I realize that the only real problem, the problem of all problems, is the problem of death. And I think, what's next? And Jesus said to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. As Martha's now thinking about something in the future, Jesus says, yeah, that's where I come in. I am the resurrection and the life. And he continues and says, the one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. See, for me, 13 years old in my faith journey, what I would have done is crossed out this phrase. See, I would have looked at a verse like this and said, okay, so the one who believes in Jesus will live. Whoever lives by believing in me will never die. I would have crossed out that ugly, that painful, that terrible, even though they die phrase. So that's why it's easy for us sometimes to look at the Bible and only tell one side of the story, to only read what we want to read. But what Jesus says to Martha and what Jesus says to me, he added an even though into his definition of faith. Even though they die, even though your brother is sitting in a tomb a few feet away, even though staph infection is in your brain, you have 104-degree fever, even though they die. And then he asked Martha a very pointed question. I think he was mirroring her tactics. He was very blunt with Martha. And he said, Martha, do you believe this? Do you believe this? Like, do you believe that I am life, even though? Do you believe that I am true life, even though you experience death? Even though your brother is in a tomb a few feet away. He said to me, do you believe? Do you believe in me, even though you have a staph infection that's threatening to kill you? Even though. Do you believe in me, even though you have Crohn's disease? Do you trust in me, even though you lost your job? Even though your finances aren't what you thought they should be at this time in your life? Even though you went through what it is you walked through, do you trust me? Do you believe in me? Even though things didn't turn out how you prayed they would turn out, even though it didn't look the way that you thought it would look, the way that you believed for, or what you thought was right and fair, do you believe? See, Martha responds to this question here in a second, and the way Martha responded, it's amazing how she responded in the moment. She says this back to Jesus. Yes, Lord, she replied. Remember the setting, remember her brother dead a few feet away. She says, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. It's easy for us to miss something here, like in the 21st century, but in the first century, Martha and Mary and other Jews had this concept of what the Messiah was going to be. The Messiah figure he was going to come from God, and he was going to come and fix things, and he was going to make everything right in the world. He was essentially, the Messiah was the one that everyone hoped for, the one that everyone looked forward to. And when Martha responds and says, yes, I believe that you are the Messiah, what she's saying is, yes, I believe that you are the hope of the world. Even though my brother's dead, even though things haven't turned out, I believe that you are the hope. Even though things don't look the way I thought they would look, even though life doesn't always go the way that we planned, I believe. See, what Jesus said in this interaction with Martha is what I learned as I was facing staph infection and starting over this brain surgery thing in that moment. What I learned is this, is that Jesus is true life, even though we experience death. True life, permanent life, eternal life, even though we experience death and even while we experience death. Like, I don't know how to explain this. Like, I thought that Jesus couldn't have been there, but even when I had an AVM sitting on my brainstem, in some way, Jesus was there. He coexisted with it. He is true life, even though we experience death. True hope. Hope that even though things don't always turn out, hope that even though we die, we have this bigger thing to look forward to. True life. See, what I thought and what we often think when we face situations like this in our life, what Mary and Martha thought was this, that if Jesus cares, he will fix it. Like, I thought if Jesus cares, he will fix it. He will come and he will heal me and he will take the pain away and everything will be okay. And if he doesn't do that, then maybe it's because he doesn't care. But what we see in this story, and what I learned in my story, is that Jesus responds to our statement by saying this, I do care, so I'll fix it. Jesus, as he burst into tears at the sight of Mary and Martha, Jesus, as he burst into tears, like I believe that Jesus wept at the fact that I was sitting in a hospital room on the night before I was about to go home with staph infection. He wept, he cares. And so he says, I'll fix it. I do care, so I'll fix it. And this may seem really confusing, but let me explain what I mean. See, what we think that the fix is in situations like this, and what Jesus knows the fix is, are often two very different things. See, we think what we need when we face death in situations like this, what we need is a physical ailment gone, or more money, or that person to come back into our lives again, like Mary and Martha were thinking. And what's crazy about that story is that that's actually what Mary and Martha get. Like, if you've ever heard that story before, Jesus, a few minutes later, walks over to the tomb of Lazarus and performs probably his greatest earthly miracle. He resurrects a dead man who had been dead for 4 days and calls Lazarus out of it. And they have their brother back. But the thing is that fix was only a temporary fix, because Lazarus died again. Like, it was a temporary resurrection. I mean, how many other dead people were there that Jesus did not resurrect? If Lazarus was still here, he'd be up here telling his story. I think that would be way more interesting right now. But the thing is that only when we are faced with death, and only when I was faced with death, sitting in that hospital room, see, we realize that the fix we need is something so much deeper than a physical ailment gone, or a temporary resurrection. See, what we need is the resurrection and the life. What I needed was to know that even though I will die, whether I'm 13 or 113 when that happens, what I needed to know is that if I live by believing in Jesus, I will never truly die. I do care, so I'll fix it. Not in the way that you thought you wanted me to, but in the way that you ultimately needed me to. So in the first century, I mentioned before this concept of the Messiah, and Mary and Martha and other Jews, and before them, during Roman oppression and Babylonian oppression, this this figure in the Jewish community of the Messiah continued to grow. And everyone looked forward to, as they were experiencing Roman oppression, they were looking forward to this messianic figure of hope, this person who would come and fix things, this great warrior. Everybody expected a great warrior who would come and conquer the Romans and restore Israel to its proper place as like a world leader. See, everyone expected this great warrior figure, and then the Messiah was born. Not in a palace, but in a manger, in a stable on the outside of town. And he grew up in a town called Nazareth, a town that nothing good had ever come from before. And when he arrived on the scene, he came not with warriors, but he came with a group of fishermen as a carpenter, working miracles and teaching us how to love one another. And then the Messiah was arrested. And it seemed like he walked into his own execution, like he was silent before his accusers, almost as if he needed to go. And he was hung on a cross, and he was laid in a tomb, and the Messiah was dead. And everyone thought, maybe he wasn't the Messiah after all. And then he showed up 3 days later. And everyone thought, okay, maybe now is the time. Like, now we're going to conquer the Romans. One of them said, Lord, is it at this time that you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus probably laughed, because he did not come as the Messiah to conquer a temporary Roman government. He came to fix the greatest problem in the history of the human race, the problem of death. See, my story has an equally good ending, actually, to the Lazarus story. The doctors did another surgery and basically gave my brain a bath with antibiotics and washed out the staph infection. And I was eventually released from the hospital. I was on antibiotics for 6 months, and I came back for a checkup. It was good, a yearly checkup. And then in 2011, I came back every year until 2011. I went to Tampa General for the final thumbs up, and they said, you're good to go. You never have to worry about this again. See, he did ultimately fix things, but he didn't fix things in the way that I thought that I needed at the time. But what I learned and what I hold on to and what my hope is not that I'm going to live forever. If I would have died at 13, or if I die at 80 or 90 or 100, that's not my hope. My hope is that I believe in this God who is true life, even though we experience death. In a moment, how we're going to close here is by singing a song by the band that I listened to in the MRI room. The band is called Mercy Me. And it's a recent song. Maybe some of you have heard it. And the chorus of the song, I've been singing it virtually all week. And the chorus goes like this. It says, I know you're able, and I know you can save through the fire with your mighty hand. But even if you don't, my hope is you alone. Before we sing, let me pray for you. Father, I thank you. Thank you, God, that you care. Father, thank you for caring so much that you sent Jesus to fix things, not ultimately in the way that we want it to be fixed all the time, but in the way that we needed it to be fixed. Lord, thank you for sending Jesus to die so that ultimately we can believe in him and find true life. Lord, thank you for teaching me to trust you in the even ifs of my story. And Father, help all of us to trust you in the even ifs that we are going to face in the future. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
They say sometimes you win some, sometimes you lose some. Right now I'm losing bad. I stood on this stage night after night, reminding the broken it'll be alright. right now. Oh, right now I just can't. It's easy to sing when there's nothing to bring me down. What will I say when I'm held to the flame like I am right now? I know you're able and I know you can save through the fire with your mighty hand. But even if you don't, my hope is you alone. They say it only takes a little faith to move a mountain. Well, good thing a little faith is all I have right now. But God, when you choose to leave mountains unmovable, oh, give me the strength to be able to sing is well with my soul. I know you're able and I know you can save through the fire with your mighty hand. But even if you don't, my hope is you alone. I know the sorrow and I know the hurt would all go away if you just say the word. But even if you don't, my hope is you alone. You've been faithful, you've been good all my days. Jesus, I will cling to you, come what may, 'cause I know you're able, and I know you can. Oh, I know you're able, I know you can save through the fire with your mighty hand. But even if you don't, my hope is you alone. And I know the sorrow, I know the hurt would all go away if you just say the word. But even if you don't, my hope is you alone. You alone. Oh, and even if you don't, my hope is you alone. It is well with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul.
My hope from hearing that story is that we'll be honest about this life we live, we'll be honest about this broken world that we live in, because the reality is every single one of us faces suffering to some degree or another. Some of us way worse than others. I can't imagine being parents of John through all of that. We all face some sort of suffering, and the reality of that is the fact that every one of us is going to die. Every one of us. But we forget that, right? We focus so much on our life and what we're doing and making enough money for retirement and doing all this stuff, and we distract and distract and distract, and we forget the greatest need we have is we're going to die. And then what? And John's story so uniquely puts him in a place where he came face to face with that. And in that moment, he met a Jesus that somehow, some way, we don't understand it fully, but somehow in some way coexisted alongside this broken world and provides the greatest answer to our greatest question. So I'm so grateful you shared that, John. That even in this mess of a world, this broken, messy thing that we have to face, and we're going to face death one day, there is a hope that's bigger than our biggest need. And that's incredible. That's what Jesus did by dying for us. So that's my hope, that as you walk out today, you will take the fact that Jesus made a way to cover our biggest need. Thank you, John.